Here we go. All right, cool. Now, let me get some music rocking before I do this. Let me see. All right. I'm about to turn this music on so we can chill and we can do this nice, relaxing stream because that's exactly what it's going to be. Okay, so I got another tier list, but it's a little bit different. It's not as serious, in my opinion, as the class one because this is a lot of subjective stuff. A lot of the class tier list was a little bit more on the objective side, right? Because it's no denying that, as an example, Survival Hunter is better than Frost Mage and DPS, right? That's just the facts. But tiering raid bosses is a little bit different because some people have different memories for certain fights, and even if you raid, like if me and my best friend raid, the same boss, if I'm a DPS and he's a healer, we're gonna have different opinions, different feelings, different viewpoints, so on and so forth. So this is pretty much subjective. Do what you will with it, but I thought it'd be fun, and I thought it'd create some more conversations, some more growing anticipation for Cataclysm Classic. So I have all of the bosses from all 3 raid tiers in Cata, from Blackwing Descent, Conclave of Four Winds or Throne of Four Winds, Bastion of Twilight, Firelands, and Dragon Soul. So we're going to talk about each and every boss. You can see my tier rankings here. I have God tier, I have King tier, above average, satisfactory, D tier, or death to pugs. You already know what time that is. We'll get old, fast, and dirt. A lot of these tiers are probably going to come with a lot of nuance, so just listen out for that. We're going to talk about a lot. I'm going to make sure I'm as fair and as concise as I can be, because some of these fights I have really fond memories of. Some of these fights I just don't like, but that's my perspective. Like I said, if you're a healer or you are a tank on some of these fights, you might have a difference of opinion. That's cool too. So we're going to talk about it. What is this music? Hold up. What is happening? This is a horrible song. I don't know what that was. All right, we here. Okay. I should have did this before. I think it'd be too. Let me see. You know what? Let me see. I'm going to put all of these in order from phase 1 to phase 3, or tier 1 to tier 3. Technically tier 11 to tier 13. So let's start with Bastion of Twilight. So Bastion of Twilight had Magma, it had Omnitron, it had Baleroc, it had Archimedes, Chimeron, Omnitron Defense System, Nefarian. I think that's it, right? 1, 2. Oh, no. What are you doing down there? Boom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then we have Conclave and Alakir. That's pretty easy. And then Bastion of Twilight had Halfis. It had V&T. It had the Ascendant Council, Cho'Gall, and Sinestra. Okay. We'll start there. We'll fix Firelands later. So let's start with the first tier. I'll keep it in the first tier. I might jump around bosses here. What are you doing in Zanos? You're not supposed to be there. But we're gonna start with the first tier for sure. And let's start on a high note. Let's start with the last fight. Some would say the hardest fight in the tier. Again, subjective difference of opinion. But let's start with Sinestra. And to me, from a DPS standpoint and partly a tank standpoint, once we started farming this, I started dabbling in different roles. think this is a god tier fight. Sinestro literally has something for everyone. Part of the phase you get a buff, right? So everyone's able to do big numbers. Healers are able to pump. DPS are able to pump. And then when the buff goes away, there's sizable amounts of damage and mechanics to react to that everyone kind of needs to react to. The tank is taking damage from Sinestro and the Drakes that's coming down. Healers are healing people, obviously. And before in phase 1, they're trying to keep Homeboy alive. They're trying to heal all the damage from the Flame Breath and the... it's not a Cutter Beam, but it's a Link Beam that people used to get. So there's a lot going on for healers. DPS are trying to DPS Sinestro down, who had a lot of health. She had an intermission, or kind of a slight intermission, where you ran off to the eggs and you had to break them down. If you didn't DPS them down fast enough, they hatched, stuff like that. So there's a lot going on for each individual role. And I think it all culminated into a really good end tier fight, because you could only do Sinestro if you killed Heroic Cho'Gall. If you killed Cho'Gall on normal, he didn't fall through the floor and unlock Sinestro's room. But if you kill him on heroic, he like did a little animation where he fell. He broke the floor of his room, his platform, and then you entered Sinestro's room through there. You couldn't do it on normal. You had to do it on heroic. And for what it was worth, I think Sinestro was a really, really good end tier fight. And I'm gonna try to be, like I said, I'm gonna try to be as fair as I can with these fights. I'm gonna try not to use my own personal views with them. But I rated most of these fights. Well, I rated all of these fights, but most of them from 2 points of view. Either I was a DPS and I brought a healer in, or I was a DPS and I tanked sometimes when we did alt runs and stuff. So I've seen multiple. I've seen these fights through multiple lenses, basically. But Sinestro definitely, to me, god tier. It had a lot to offer. Next, we will do. Let's do Chimeron. Chimeron was, for those who don't remember, I'm going to put him in Satisfactory. Chimeron was the fight where he did a really big attack, a really big AoE that brought everyone down to like 10k health. Just a really low amount. And whenever you have fights like that where it brings everyone down to a certain threshold and healers are supposed to control that threshold, like it really didn't do anything to top people up back to 100%, because Chimeron just had a mechanic that would just immediately drop everyone back down. So healers kind of had to not only control people's health, but also control their mana, control their overhealing. And that was really like the crux of the mechanics. Yes, he had a tank swap, but every fight has a tank swap. But it was really on the healers to kind of control the fight. And whenever you have fights like that, it could go either way, go left or right. And I think Chimeron is a case where it wasn't too much going on. You didn't have to kite him or do any kind of crazy movement. He didn't spawn any pools or anything like that. But it was enough to where it was like, all right, this is a cool little fight to kind of shake things up. I think Blackwing Descent in it of itself had a lot of different style fights where you didn't feel like you were doing kind of the same thing over and over and over. So I award that to Blackwing Descent. But yeah, like I said, I don't think Chimeron was an overly top of the line fight, but it wasn't bad. So I put him in Satisfactory for right now. He's at the top of the Satisfactory tier. Next, let's talk about, so I did a Bastion of Twilight fight. I did a Blackwing Descent fight. Let's go to Conclave of Four Winds. Let's do I keep calling the raid the Conclave of Four Winds when it's really called the Throne of Four Winds. The first boss is the Conclave of Four Winds. And with the first boss, I'm gonna be honest with you, I think the first boss is bad. I think it's dirt. Because the whole thing about the first boss is you were jumping from platform to platform, right? You were using the little jump streams to go from platform to platform, and you dealt with each individual fight. And each boss only had like one mechanic or something like that. And if no one was on any given platform at a time, they just did like raid right AoE. So you had to break up your raid group. You put some people on this platform, some people on this platform, some people on this platform. It sounds good in theory. I know that sounds like, oh, that sounds like a dope fight. Trust and believe, it really wasn't a good fight. Like, the bosses had not difficult mechanics. They were really only difficult if you didn't split your raid up enough. Or not, I shouldn't say enough. They were difficult if you didn't split your raid group optimally, is what I'll say. But I just remember going into Conclave and I'm like, yo, why are we doing this fight? Like, it's not fun jumping around from platform to platform. And the crazy part is, when I was doing this fight, I didn't even jump around. I stayed on the nature platform and I had to kite ads, and it wasn't fun. And I don't even attribute that to me not liking this fight or it being dirt, because I did it on other tunes where I didn't have to kite, and I just kind of felt the same way. It's like, yo, this is just kind of like a waste of time. I felt like it was a good fight, or it was good in theory, but I feel like the execution was a little off. Did not like the Conclave before it wins. Back to Bastion of Twilight. Let's start with the first boss. Let's go Halfist. So Halfist, to me, I think he's an above average first boss. Now we've had so many expansions now, so it's easy to kind of muddle Halfist down because we've had a couple of really good first boss raid fights. I think Shriekwing from Castle Nathri, even though Castle Nathri in and of itself was a great raid, Shriekwing was a really good first boss. People love Shriekwing. So I don't know if he's Shriekwing level, but to me, again, Halfist is a fight where it's very varied. You had Halfist himself, you had the four dragons that were caged, and when you released them, they gave him a buff, but they also gave him a detriment. And it was kind of cool mixing and matching, seeing that, okay, this dragon released gives him the ability to stun the raid, but he also will periodically get stunned, freeing up a lot of damage and, giving a pause moment for healers to catch their breath. This dragon gives him a fire ability, but it also makes us take reduced fire damage from the other mobs. So I think Halfist was varied enough, especially for a first boss. Normally you don't see pick and choose mechanics like that on the first boss. So Halfist was one of those fights where I think it was varied enough, and it was a decently challenging fight on heroic, because I'm trying to gauge and rank these fights on their heroic counterparts too. I think it was decent enough on both levels where it was like, all right, it was decently challenging. It wasn't over the top, it wasn't overbearing, but most first bosses aren't. And it had a lot going on for first boss. I think Halfist is definitely above average. So that's Bastion. So let's go back to Blackwing Descent. And let's see, who do I want to... it's right here. Nefarian, the last boss in Blackwing Descent. I think he's king tier. Nefarian was a really good end fight. I know a lot of people necessarily didn't like the fact that we were fighting Onyxia again for, the third time, because Onyxia is a part of the Nefarian fight, and like people are kind of like over the nostalgia trip of Onyxia. This music is terrible. I might just turn this off. Like I don't like this playlist. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, fuck this music. No cap. Anyway, yeah, people were kind of like you can miss me with bringing Onyxia back, even though she really wasn't. To me, she wasn't really that big a part of the fight. If Onyxia was still alive during the first lava intermission, your raid was wiped. It was already done. So she wasn't really that a large part of the fight. She didn't last too long, but people still kind of felt kind of mad about Onyxia. But the rest of Nefarian, I think he had a pretty solid fight. His lava intermissions were interesting. Having to swim on the platform, DPS to add, and still deal with one of the most oppressive abilities in Cata, fucking Crackle. That was a hard fight, but not hard fight. That was an interesting mechanic, but Nefarian in itself, when you do the fight completely and you do it correctly and you see all the details of it, I think he was actually a really good end tier fight. So Nefarian, I'm going to put in king tier. He was pretty good. Like I said, Onyxia kind of gives him a little slight, but to me, Onyxia didn't last long enough in that fight for me to really count it against Nefarian, to be honest. Okay. Let's do Alakir, since he's the only boss remaining in the Throne of the Four Winds. And I'll be honest, I think Alakir kind of goes into the D tier to the Death to Pugs tier. That's because Alakir wasn't an easy fight, and it wasn't a good fight. So whenever you have a bad fight that's not good, and he was kind of a lengthy fight on top of everything, I feel like that just you kind of set yourself up for putting in D tier. So yeah, Alakir, I think, is definitely, when Cataclysm comes around. I mean, this is back in the day. It might be a different story completely when Cataclysm comes around, where people will probably be able to pug Alakir, on both difficulties more freely. But he was a nightmare to pug, especially on heroic. Like, Alakir was a tough fight to pug on heroic, and some would say he was more difficult than Sinestra. I personally didn't feel that way, but I could see the comparison. But in my opinion, when you have... The only cool thing I'll give Alakir is, if you were a hunter, right, and you saw the tornado wall coming towards you, you could jump off the platform and disengage back on. That was pretty cool. I guess cool little tech. But other than that, like, he really didn't have anything too endearing about him. They brought back the Malygos mechanic where at like his final phase, he dropped the platform everyone's running on, and now everyone is flying around, and you got to group up and then move out of the lightning cloud. Like, that was, I was indifferent about it. I didn't really mind that mechanic, but I know people who hate Malygos and in turn hate that that mechanic that reminds them of Malygos. So I could see them not liking Alec here too much. But I mean, I put him in detail. I didn't think he was that great a fight, even with my indifference about the Malygos flying around mechanic. I think it was just kind of blah. Okay. Next, back to Blackwing Descent. Let's do Omnitron Defense System. I think Omnitron Defense System goes in the above average tier. So Omnitron was an early fight as well. So the way Blackwing Lair is set up, not Blackwing Lair, I'm bugging. Blackwing Descent is set up is you had choices really throughout the entirety of the raid. As soon as you zone in, if you go left, you have Magma. If you go right, you have Omnitron Defense System. You can pick and choose. Once they're both dead and you take the elevator down, the infamous elevator that killed a lot of people in Blackwing Descent. Once you take that elevator down, on the left side was Chimeron, on the right side was Maloriak, and way in the back, and the I won't say center, but middle, was Archimedes. So you had the choice throughout the whole raid of what order you wanted to do the bosses, which I thought was pretty cool. Omnitron was more often than not, in my experience, the second pick that people chose, even in Pugs when I did it. Like, people always chose Omnitron second because I guess they felt like Magma was a little bit easier, which in retrospect, I don't think he was. I think they're both kind of on equal pacing in terms of difficulty, but with Omnitron, you had two bosses active at the same time, which always kind of maybe throws Pug groups for a loop, and each boss had their own mechanic. And then if you look at the heroic mechanic, Nefarian appears in the fight and he empowers one of the bosses, and then they get a bonus to their whatever their mechanic was. So Omnitron for an early fight had a lot going for it, but it never felt oppressive in my opinion. It never felt like there was too much thrown into this pot. It always felt like you were just right there on the cusp of being a over oppressive fight. But I thought it was pretty cool. I think everything lined up. I think the confines of the area that you're fighting Omnitron, it was a little bit smaller, so it made the encounter a little bit more intimate, which is a good or bad thing depending on what you how you feel about it. But I think a lot of the mechanics melded together well with Omnitron, so I would put them in the above average tier. Next, let's go back to Bastion of Twilight. Let's do V&T, and I think they're just satisfactory. So I don't remember these. I think it's Valiona and Thoralion, I think is their names. I think they were not only a step down in scope from Halfus, because you went from dealing with this boss with a multitude of mechanics, or who could have a multitude of mechanics, to really, they're not typical dragons because they have a breath, they have a tail swipe, but they also have other things going for it. And on heroic, it changed up because you had to tank them. I think one tank had to be in one phase to tank one dragon, one tank had to be in the other. So it kind of varied on heroic, but I feel like this wasn't a super standout fight, especially in a raid like Bastion of Twilight, where I feel like the fights, each individual fight was pretty decent, but V&T kind of was like the lackluster one of the bunch. It didn't really stand out and do anything super spectacular to me. So, and that's from a tank and a DPS standpoint. Like, healers might feel differently, but then again, I feel like even with the healers, all you're really doing is healing people if they get caught by the dragon breath, because the dragon, when they breathe, they did a 180-degree arc. So sometimes people got caught on the wrong end, and all you're doing is healing soak damage. So there's not really much going on there, especially once you get gear and you put it on farm. So yeah, I think V&T is just okay. It's nothing crazy. A good flip is that it didn't last too long, so I wouldn't put it in the same tier as Alakir, which was just kind of a long fight for no reason. But I mean, I can't say for no reason. He is the second to last fight. He is the last fight, second and last fight in the Throne of the Four Winds. And lore-wise, he is the Elemental Lord of Air, so I guess his fight kind of had to be lengthy. It's like Ragnaros, the Elemental Lord of Fire. We all know Ragnaros 20-minute fights. But anyway, we'll get to Ragnaros in a little bit later. But yeah, V&T to me is just okay. It's just okay. Nothing spectacular. Nothing too bad, just okay. Back to Blackwing Descent. Let's do Baleroc. And Baleroc is an interesting one because I felt like Baleroc was he definitely was a pug killer. He definitely was a pug killer. Especially on heroic. Like, there was a lot of things to mess up with Baleroc. From a DPS standpoint, I don't think he was as bad. I could even see space for him in the Satisfactory, but to me, he felt like an odd break in the boss lineup, right? Because let's say you took the path, you killed Magmar, which we'll talk about a little bit. You killed Omnitron Defense System, which we already talked about. Chimeron, we talked about. But then Baleroc just had a multitude of mechanics that, to me, didn't mesh well. His theme was like he was like the scientist for Nefarian, so he was like mixing potions and doing stuff like that. And it was cool the first time, and maybe the second time, and possibly the third time. But after a while, it's like, all right, Baleroc, I really don't care. I really don't care. And like I said, he was a pug killer. Baleroc was one that could definitely wipe a pug more often than not. More often than any other fight, in my opinion, outside of Nefarian, than in Blackwing Descent. So Baleroc, I think, goes in the D tier because he wasn't a really standout fight anyway, in my opinion. Next, let's go back to Bastion of Twilight. Let's do Cho'Gall. I think Cho'Gall goes in King tier. Cho'Gall also, just like Nefarian, had a lot going for it, especially on heroic. Not the introduction, I shouldn't say that, but the reemergence of the corruption bar, right? That was kind of a thing because we didn't see that for quite some time, right? I think the last time we actually saw a corruption bar was, at this point when Cata came out, was Yogg with his insanity mechanic, right? So seeing that bar again, having to manage that, everyone having to manage that resource, and then it really put like the added pressure on in the Cho'Gall fight. Plus, he wasn't like a super easy fight. He was actually a pretty difficult fight, especially on heroic. In all scopes, he had high tank damage, he had mechanics that did high raid damage, and he had adds that if you didn't deal with handily, they would wipe your raid. So he definitely was a fight that had a lot going for it, a lot of variance, on top of the fact that you had to manage corruption. So he definitely gets put in the King tier. Next, let's do Magmar. Magmar, I'm gonna put at the top of Satisfactory. I will individually tier these later on, but I'm gonna put Magmar at the top of Satisfactory, slightly above average, because I don't think Magmar is as good as Omnitron Defense or Halfist, but he's like right there. So fun fact with Magmar, I got my promotion to main raider in my first hardcore guild by fighting Magmar, and the strat was I was a Death Knight, and if you ever heard anything about Cata, if you played Death Knight or you played Frost DK, they called you Death Kite because there was a lot of strats that just involved kiting, and Death Knights were one of the best kiters in the game at the time. They could spec into Chillblains and anything with chill. So basically, Chillblains worked is if you had Frost Fever on you, you also slowed by 50%. Howling Blast was the capstone ability in the Frost Tree. Howling Blast applied Frost Fever, which then applied Chillblains. We all know Howling Blast is an AoE ability, so it means you had an AoE slow that did a lot of damage, that hit a lot of mobs clumped up. You see the math. So on Magmar, he spawned little worms, and I literally had to hit them with Howling Blast, make sure I was in Blood Presence, and run around a circle for 5 minutes. Wasn't the most fun and intuitive gameplay I've ever did, but it was there. I will say I did get my chances after I did that stuff. I think I did that like 3 or 4 times, and then I just started DPSing. Magmar is a fight that, again, in similar vein to Halfist and Omnitron, had a couple things going for it. So it summoned, especially on heroic, it summoned the worms. On heroic, it summoned a skeleton that had to be tanked and killed. Magmar had a pull down mechanic where you had to there was chains on him, and you had to pull him down and smash his head onto a spike that was in the room. And when he was on there, he was obviously stunned for a little bit, and he took increased damage. All of those things combined, I think, melded into a pretty decent first fight. Wasn't oppressive. The worms kind of got out of hand if you didn't deal with them right. But like I said, most guilds either had a hunter or had a Death Knight to kite them around. So They really weren't a problem. Like I said, Magmar I think is top of satisfactory, right under above average. I just don't know if he's as good as Halfus or Omnitron. Next, let's do Archimedes. Archimedes was the Sound Dragon. I'm just going to finish up here. So Archimedes was the Sound Dragon. I think Archimedes will get old fast. Now, the mechanic of using sound and hitting the gongs and stuff like that, that stuff is cool and all, but it's not like those are just skins for other things we've seen before, right? And it's a dragon, you know, it's breathing fire, tail swipe, the whole kit caboodle. But yeah, I think Archimedes is a fight that'll just get old fast, and Archimedes is another one that I think it's not a pug killer, right? It's not a pug killer, so I wouldn't put it in D tier because I think, to be fair, I think it's a better fight than Maloriak and Alakir. But these fights at least have more variance than the same old hit a gong, stun them, DPS them, next hit a gong, stun them, DPS them, next hit a gong, stun them, DPS them. You get the picture, right? There's no big phase change for Archimedes. There's no, unless you were spamming the gong, so it was a one click and you're done. You click the gong or you click the bell and it went away. And if you click them too fast and Archimedes destroyed them all too fast, then you were kind of in a situation. Things got critical. But other than that, if you did the fight correctly, yeah, it just got old pretty quick. So I'll put them in the get old fast thing. So that's all the Bastion of Twilight. Let's move on to the final bosses in the Bastion of Twilight. Oh, wait, what did I just say? No, that's all the bosses in Blackwing Descent. Let's move on to the final boss in Bastion of Twilight. And that is the Ascendant Council. So the Ascendant Council, to me, this is a two-pronged thing. I definitely think it's a pug killer, but it's not a D tier. I think it's actually a pretty decent fight when you look back on it, but it most certainly is a pug killer. TLDR, I'll put it in satisfactory and then I'll talk about it. So TLDR for Ascendant Council, just like Omnitron, there's 4 total bosses, two active at a time. One tank takes one tank takes the other, and their mechanics counteract each other. So for the first phase of the council, there's a fire and then there's a water boss. They have mechanics that counteract each other. Whereas, like, if you have a water debuff and you go stand next to the fire people, they'll get a buff. If you have a fire debuff and you go stand next to the water people, they'll get a buff. There's other things going on. I'm just kind of rushing through it, but they had pretty good unison for that. And it's the same thing when you got rid of the first 2 bosses and then the earth and the air elemental guys jump down. Same thing. There's an earth mechanic that cancels out the air. There's an air mechanic that cancels out the earth. The trick with the Elemental Council is you didn't DPS them down to 0. You had to DPS them down. Once one of the bosses got to 25%, they immediately stopped, and then you would switch to the next boss. Or the next set of bosses, I should say. And then when you got one of the bosses in the next set got to 25%, then they would go into phase 3. And what they would do is, you might have heard this, they famously come together like Captain Planet, and they form, all 4 Ascendant Council members form one boss. And his health pool is a combination of whatever health the bosses were at the time of the phase change. So the trick was you had to make sure both of the bosses were as close to 25% as possible, because you didn't want one at 25% or one at 100%. See what I'm saying? Like, you couldn't just burn one down because of that. You would have a really, really, really long third phase, and no one wanted that. So yeah, so with this fight, like I said, it's definitely a pug killer, but it's not D tier, right? It's not D tier because it's better than these 2 fights. So I'll put it in satisfactory because I do like the combination and stuff like that, but trying to pug this fight early on might be a nightmare. And that's it for the first phase. As we look at it, I think I'm pretty comfortable where everything's at. There's not a lot of bosses here to dispute it, so we'll just quickly move on into the best tier that Blizzard has made in a long time, and that's the Firelands tier. So, you know what, just for simplicity's sake, let's put this in order. So we have Shannox, Ryo, Alysrazor, Beth'tilac actually goes before that, Baleroc, Majordomo, and Ragnaros. Excuse me. Make sure that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Perfect. Okay. So, Firelands. The first boss, Shannox. I'm going to definitely put Shannox in the above average list. So, Shannox had a couple good things, in my opinion, going for it. Number one, he wasn't confined to one specific area. Technically speaking, the entirety of the Firelands raid was his area. You could fight him almost anywhere. I don't think you could bring... I've never tried it, so somebody out there, if you did this before, quote me. You can change or correct me if I'm wrong. But I don't think you could bring him up to Beth'tilac's room when Beth'tilac was dead. But you could basically fight Shannox anywhere. I fought Shannox in the beginning of the instance, like down the ramp in that little area. I fought him in Alysrazor's area. I fought him in Baleroc's area. I fought him all over the place. I never was a part of a raid during Cata's time that brought him into the spider area. But I fought Shannox in a multitude of places. So that's number one. I like that, right? Because when you change the environment, you change how you do fights, stuff like that. Number two, summoning him was pretty unique too, because he wasn't active immediately when you zoned in. You had to kill a certain amount of trash mobs to get him to leave. I think he's in Alysrazor's room at the start, or Baleroc. It's one of the enclosed areas. You had to kill a certain amount of trash to get him to spawn, right? That's number two. When you did summon him and you wanted to engage him, it was him, and he had 2 dog ads that you had to also fight, and they also had to be tamed. And I think Shannox, for a first fight, again, very similar to Halfus, had a few mechanics that kind of combined with one another, but none of them felt oppressive to deal with. So he had, because he's technically a hunter, he's a flame walker, he's a hunter, he had 2 traps, one that exploded, did a lot of damage, one that that trapped a player if they ran over, or trapped a dog if you brought it over. I thought that was pretty cool. He had a fair amount of burst damage, so healers weren't just sitting on their laurels. He did a fair amount of tank damage. Like, it was just a lot going on in a high movement area that made the feel of Shannox, I think, carried the weight of the mechanics, even though the mechanics were pretty cool too. So Shannox, I'm going to put in above average tier. I wouldn't put him above Omnitron or Halfus, but he is deserving of the above average, especially for a first boss. Next, we have Beth'tilac. Beth'tilac is the spider boss. I'm gonna put Beth'tilac in king tier. Beth'tilac is or Deathwing. Am I saying it wrong? I gotta look it up. I might be saying it wrong. That's crazy. Let me see. I don't want to keep saying it wrong. The Firelands. Let's see. I had part of the page opened up. I just want to see what the boss names are. I might be saying that really wrong. That's crazy. I don't know why it won't let me open this. Here we go. Boom. Boom, boom, boom. Bosses. It is Beth'tilac. Okay, I wasn't tripping. All right, bet. So, yeah, Beth'tilac was a really, really fun fight, in my opinion. And I don't think it mattered what you did, whether you were tanking, whether you were healing, whether you were DPSing. This was actually a fight I actually got a chance to do all 3. And I enjoyed it thoroughly for each role. And this was another varied fight. This was an early on fight. Some people did Beth'tilac first. I always just remember when I was in a raid group, or if I pugged it, we always did Shannox first. But I do remember having friends who went to Beth'tilac first, because you're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. You were killing all the trash leading up to Beth'tilac's area, and then killing the trash in the area. So that's also contributing to releasing Shannox. And once you kill Beth'tilac, I think if you had all that trash killed, he immediately just popped out. But yeah, Beth'tilac had a lot going for it. You had the first phase where she would periodically jump down and then jump back up. There was 2 levels. She would jump down, jump back up. She spawned both tankable ads and ads that weren't tanked that just had to get DPS'd. Her heroic mode was crazy because she had spiders that fixated on people, and you had to intercept them. I remember intercepting them. Like, I would run. There would be a line between the person and the spider. I would run in between the line, hit AMS, soak it, make sure the person didn't die, keep it pushing. Like, there was massive AoE damage. She would jump up to the top of her web platform and then just rain fire down on people, keeping the healers active. Like, there was a lot going on in Beth'tilac, but it culminated in a lot. On top of that, she dropped pretty good gear too. So Beth'tilac, I think, is definitely in the king tier, because I didn't expect that level of, I guess, subjective, but fun, quote unquote, that early in the fight. And I think that just speaks to how good Firelands was. Next, we have Lord Rhyolith, the infamous steering fight. I think Rhyolith, there's an argument that Rhyolith could get old fast because he's kind of a one-trick pony as well. Rhyolith is, let me put it back down before I tear. So Rhyolith, if you've never done it, the way you kill Rhyolith is you control the way he moves, right? You DPS his leg. You can DPS his left leg or his right leg. And throughout his platform, because you're fighting him on one platform, he summons volcanoes. You had to steer him into the volcano to step on it to not only break his armor, but stop the volcano from doing AoE damage. And if you hit his right leg, he turned right. If you hit his left leg, he's turned left. And he always just perpetually moved forward. But you could actually turn him. And I think that was a cool idea. The reason why I say it could possibly go into get old fast is because that's really the combination of the fight. Now, he did have a phase where after a certain amount of volcano steps, you kind of like, as you were DPSing him, he slowly lost armor. And his kind of quote unquote second phase was he sheds all his armor and then he just becomes a stank and spank. You don't steer him anymore. I would give points to that if he did something else other than just be a tank and spank. But the reason why I wouldn't put him in get old fast is because Rhyolith actually isn't a long fight. He doesn't overstay his welcome. You kind of get him and get him out the way quick. So that's the only thing that to me that saves him from getting old fast. So I would put Rhyolith somewhere in the upper satisfactory section here because he had an interesting mechanic, especially if you were driving. If you were assigned to actually be the director to drive Rhyolith, it was actually pretty fun. I did that on a number of occasions because Frosty Case had a lot of instant bursts, so it was really, really easy for a Frosty Case to make quick turns, well, relatively quick turns with Rhyolith because you could just pop Pillar Frost every minute and immediately just spin him. So I'll put him higher than Chimeron. We'll put him higher there. We'll revisit this, but yeah, I think he's upper satisfactory, argument for above average. Next, we have Alysrazor. And Alysrazor, this might be a hot take, but I would put Alysrazor in the God tier. Alysrazor had a lot going for it, especially if you were the one who got a chance to fly in Alysrazor. TLDR, Alysrazor was a fight where she was in a pretty large room by comparison to the other fights. She was in a pretty large room, and she really stayed in the air, kind of. She would fly around just in raining hell on the raid. The way you kind of DPS'd her is you sent one or two people up. I don't remember the exact number, but you sent some people up, and they would have to fly through rings. And every time you flew through a ring, you got a small haste buff and a small crit buff that's stacked. So certain classes would just absolutely demolish Alysrazor and have a blast doing it. Fire Mage is an infamous one, even though at this time, Fire wasn't really the go-to spec, but Fire Mages, I remember just having a blast, just going up there and just spamming, because you got so much haste to the point where Pyroblast became like a 1 second cast time. You were just spamming Pyroblast over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And obviously, as a Fire Mage, that sounds fun, right? On the ground, there was a lot going on. You had to dodge Alysrazor's, talons. You had to deal with big ads and little ads. There was a lot going on the ground side too. So the ground just wasn't, just sitting there twiddling their thumbs. But if you got a chance to fly, Alysrazor was fun. And I think I never tanked this fight, but I definitely DPS'd and healed it. So I'm going to speak from that point of view. I think Alysrazor had more than it should have going on for it as a kind of a midpoint fight. Because Alysrazor was kind of the midpoint of Firelands, depending on how you did the fights, right? But I say more than what it should have going for it in a good way, because all of the things culminated together. You felt like if the people flying up were doing their job and the people on the ground were doing their job, you kind of brought the raid together in a pretty decent way. So I like Alysrazor. I'm going to put her in God tier because she really had a mechanic that isn't like anything else from the preceding bosses of this tier. So yeah, I'm going to put Alysrazor up there. She's God tier. And she dropped him out. That's always great, right? Technically, Ragnaros did too. Next, we have Baleroc, the infamous Shard boss. And Baleroc, to me, there's a couple spots Baleroc can go in. Baleroc can go in the will get old fast tier. But Baleroc is another one to me that the fight wasn't too long. So I don't know if he actually will get old fast. He could definitely go in the death to pugs tier because Baleroc was definitely a fight where if you were mismanaging his shards, or people were just like, not paying attention and just standing next to a shard that spawned because they're not looking at the floor, they're looking at, their damage meter, they're looking at their action bar, it could definitely kill somebody and kill the raid. But if things go well, he could also be put in satisfactory. So with Baleroc, I think I would probably put him in the... Taking into account his heroic and his normal mode, taking into account where you fight him, because he's kind of a patchwork fight. He's not really... You don't really move him. He's definitely a stationary fight. So I consider that like kind of like a patchwork fight where you're standing, you're keeping him still, and everyone's doing kind of stuff around you. I would put him at the top of Death to Bugs. I don't think he is in the same vein as these fights, right? Because it's not really that interesting, especially I think on the tank side. It's really not that interesting. Like, especially if you're assigned like the shadow tank. Like, so TLDR again. For Baleroc, the tank mechanic, one tank takes the fire sword, one tank takes the shadow sword. The problem was he really didn't do the shadow sword too often, right? He only did it like, especially if your DPS was good, you're probably only seeing the shadow sword like twice, 3 times. So if you're the off tank and your job is to taunt when he equips his shadow sword, and you only see it 3 times, you're not really doing anything. You know what I mean? From a healer standpoint, I guess this is the flip. It can get pretty cool because the shards that he summons, somebody has to stand next to it, and if you heal them, you get a little buff, and if you heal the tank, they also get a buff. So the healing is actually pretty fun on Baleroc. DPS is kind of meh. Like, sometimes it's annoying having to stand next to shards, especially if somebody messes it up. But if everything is going right, it still kind of sucks. But at least it's a little bit better than someone messing it up. So DPSing is good. So I would say this is a fight where if you're OT, this fight is terrible. If you're a DPS, it's varying. If you're a healer, you're going to have fun. But if you're in a full pug, this is probably a fight that's going to kill you a couple times. But I think it's better than Alakir and Maloriak, even if he's just a patchwork fight. Next, we have the penultimate boss, Majordomo Fandral Staghelm, and I'm going to be honest with you. Majordomo might be dirt tier, bro. That might be a hot take, but hear me out. So Majordomo so the way he worked was, depending on how the raid was stacked or how they were spread, he changed form. So if the raid was stacked up, he turned into a scorpion. If the raid was spread out, he turned into a cat. And I might be missing a form there, right? And on heroic, everyone had a meter. And if the meter got filled up, you did like 100% increased damage and healing. If you took an attack or something, I think if you took damage by something specific, the meter went down and you lost the damage buff, right? And that's really it. And to be quite honest with you, there were guilds, even back in the day, that, again, remember, he has the mechanic. If you're stacked up, he's a scorpion. If you're spread out, he's a cat. There were guilds that would just stack up, stay stacked, get the buff, and keep him in scorpion phase, because while he's in scorpion phase, he did melee, he did auto attacks, but his main mechanic was just like a fire cleave that just cleaves everybody stacked, split between everybody, right? Damage. It hit the tank, and it split between everybody stacked next to the tank, right? And what people would do is stack up on the tank and just roll cooldowns. And you would have someone call for barrier. Barrier's over. Someone call for Spirit Link Totem. Spirit Link Totem's over. Someone call for Trank. Someone call for Divine Hymn. Someone call for Tree Form. You get the picture. And that's it. And then he would die. And for the second to last fight to just be stack and kill, that's horrible. That's horrible, horrible, horrible. Especially for someone who's so lore significant, like Fandral Staghelm. Not only was he a druid trainer in vanilla and maybe TBC, I don't know, but he has like a whole quest line. Like when the Firelands comes out, like when that patch releases, he has a whole quest line on his corruption, and he's taunting you throughout the Firelands. Like he's part of the little RP section in Alysrazor. So they're building him up to be a good fight, and he just wasn't. The plane just did not land, in my opinion. Like, I think T-Swift, the Flame Druid in Yggdrasil and Dragon of Flight, he's a better fight than he's probably what Fandral should have been, minus the super reliance on weak auras, right? Because it wasn't just a stack and kill, and that's what Fandral ended up being. He was just a stay stacked, roll CDs, kill him, and move on to Ragnaros, which was kind of nutty for a penultimate lore significant boss. So yeah, I would put him in dirt tier because that's just terrible and boring. Like, yeah, you get the pump, but it's like it's boring. Just boring. Standing here and doing your rotation. That's boring. That's not a fight to me. Next, we have probably one of the most infamous hard mode fights, and that's Ragnaros, aka Ragnaros. And Ragnaros has a lot of good things going for it and some bad things going for it. So let's talk about it. So Ragnaros number 1, good things that are going for Ragnaros is, number 1, he's way better than his vanilla counterpart, but that should be, right? He's not just doing fireballs and auto attacks and summoning one ad. No, this Ragnaros is different. In normal, he's doing, AoEs on the ground that if you stand in them, you're dead. He's slamming his hand. He has an intermission phase where he's slamming his hammer in the middle of the ground, and you got to run from left to right and dodge ads and dodge Cs and do all that stuff. He's summoning ads in his second or phase 2.5. He's doing just a lot. And if you're rating on heroic, not only is his health pool increased, but he has an additional phase where, I don't know if you can see from the picture here, but he's standing up with legs. Maybe I'll see if I can find a better picture. But he stands up. He rises from his little lava pool, and he's chasing you around. You have to kite him into vines and use this bubble buff to like dispel the flame that he puts on the ground. So it's a lot going on. A lot going on for Ragnaros. I think Ragnaros, his fight was a really good end fight. The concern with Ragnaros is he was one of the hardest fights on hard mode. And on top of all that, it was like a 20-minute fight. So wiping on him just felt terrible because it was like a 5-phase fight. And a wipe was just so demoralizing, especially if you made it to the final phase where he is walking around and you wiped. Like, wipes on Ragnaros was so demoralizing. But the phases in between, because he had like 3 phases, he had the World and Flame intermission phases, and then the final phase. Like, it was a lot going on with Ragnaros. But like I said, he had good points and he had bad points. So with Ragnaros, I'm going to put him at the top of the above average tier because he is not just satisfactory. Ragnaros is a really good fight. If I can move it. There we go. I'll just do that. But yeah, Ragnaros goes at the top of above average. I don't know if I can put him with the king tiers because I progressed on hard mode on all of these fights. Cho'Gall is similar in time length, but not similar in oppressiveness. He doesn't have, like, Cho'Gall doesn't have, 5 phases plus like 2 intermission phases, right? He doesn't have those. You just kind of really got to manage. It's really about managing your corruption with Cho'Gall. So even though Cho'Gall is kind of a lengthy fight, he's not as oppressive. Like, a wipe on Cho'Gall isn't as oppressive as Rag is. Even Sinestra. Sinestra is a pretty lengthy fight. But the caveat to Sinestra is she starts the fight at like 40%. So she's not even full health, right? And again, Sinestra isn't a fight that has 5 phases and like 3 intermission phases, right? So Ragnaros, because of his time length and just the value and him just being a difficult fight, like a long, difficult fight is always going to feel bad. Always going to feel bad. Even when it feels good, it's going to feel bad at some point. So Rag I put at top of above average, but I don't know if I could put him in king or god tier. Okay, that is all of the Firelands, and now we're going into the final tier of the Cataclysm expansion, and honestly, probably my least favorite tier, but we're going to talk about it. I promised that I would be unbiased, so we're going to talk about it. Let's talk about dragons. So I'm going to put these bosses in order real quick. So it goes, Madness of Deathwing definitely goes last. Xanatos goes up here. Hagara goes up here. Traxian goes here, and that's the order. Okay, let's start with Morchok. I'm gonna keep it 1,000. Keep it a stat. Morchok is dirt. Not just because he's made of rocks, but because his boss fight. I'll give it this: the first like 2 to 3 times you do Morchok, it might be alright, right? And then you realize that this is it. And then you realize that this is the beginning of the raid. So there's really no escaping this. So you gotta do this. And then to top that all off, his heroic mode, like the change in heroic, is he just splits in 2. So what do? You just divide the raid up. Okay, if you're in a 10-man, one tank, one healer, 3 DPS over there. One tank, one healer, 3 DPS over there on the other side. And that's it. If you're in 25-man, it's the same thing. It's just the same mechanic. Sure, they hit harder. Sure, he has more health, but it's a very, very lazy fight. And I give Blizzard more flack for Morchok because we just came off of some really good starter fights. Halfus was a really good starter fight. Really good first boss. Magmar was a pretty decent first boss. Omnitron was a pretty decent first boss. Shannox was a pretty decent first boss. And then we get Rockman, who just splits. Like, nothing. No nuance to him at all. Morchok to me, pretty dirt. Pretty dirt. Next we have Yorsage, which is the slime boss. And I gotta be honest, this is a fight where your experience with this probably varies based off of your role, whatever you did. As a DPS, to me, this kind of gets old fast. Because all you're really doing is killing slime, get a buff, or stop a debuff, kill a boss. Chase a slime, kill it, get a buff, stop a debuff, kill a boss. That's not really great. That's not really compelling. Healers, on the other hand, though, might love this fight because you had the blue slime that drained all the mana but put it in the ball, and then it burst and you got all your mana back. You had, I think there was the black one. I don't remember what it did. I don't remember what all these mechanics do. It's been a long time, but I kind of remember. But you had the black slime that did something different. You had the yellow slime that did something different. So the healer experience on Yorsage probably different than the tank and the DPS one. The tank one is you just tank and swap. There's nothing really going on. Yorsage wasn't a stationary fight. You could move her, but for the most part, you just kept her in the middle. There was no real need to move her unless you were trying to like etch out a few more yards to avoid a slime to give more your raiders a chance to kill it, right? Other than that, you just kind of kept her in the middle. But I think Yorsage is one that just kind of gets old fast. It's not a pug killer, and it's not as good as the other tiers up here. It's just one that just gets old fast. It's better than these fights, though. I'll give it that. It's more varied than these fights. Next, we have Xana's. And with Xana's, that was the infamous beach ball fight where you had the melee group and the range group, and they would bounce that shadow orb back and forth, and then they would let it hit the boss, and they would go into his like little shadow intermission phase. This is another one where you probably had more fun on this fight as a healer than you did as any other role, because like I said, there's a shadow ball bouncing between the two groups, so there's ample stuff to heal there. The tank is still taking damage, so there's healing there. And when you finally let the shadow ball hit the boss, it did just a lot. There was a lot of AoE healing to be done. So as a healer, you probably like this fight. As a DPS, especially melee, it was incredibly annoying having to like spin your camera depending on your setup. Or your raid setup to try to see where the ball is at and then moving, and then sometimes the ball would just like literally pass right through your character model and not count as a bounce. It was just a lot, and then hit the boss, and then you would enter his intermission too early. A lot of things went wrong. Before I would have put this in dirt tier, but again, if you're a healer, you definitely feel differently about this. So I'll put this in D tier. Even though it does definitely have the potential to be a pug killer, because there will be pugs who don't see the ball, let the ball hit the boss early, stuff like that. But it's not a super pug killer. It's not a pug killer like Baleroc and Alakir and Baleroc. But I don't know if it'll get old fast because it does have a unique mechanic to it, so it helps break up the monotony of weeks of raiding. But it's not a fun fight, or it's only a fun fight for one role in my opinion. Next, we have Hagara, the shaman boss. This fight I actually liked. This fight was actually a really good fight in my opinion. A lot of variants on here. With Hagara, you had, her intermission phase where she had like the big blizzard and you had to run around the room avoiding her blizzard storm. Then you fought her, and then I think this was the fight where you had to like line up certain things. Like, this is a fun fight. This is also a fun fight. This is also sorry, not a fun, but also a lucrative fight where you could sell the legendary for the rogues. Like this boss is part of the Rogue Dagger legendary quest line. So what you would do is you would go here, you would get here, and then you would advertise selling Hagara pickpockets, because what the rogues had to do was zone in and pickpocket a piece of the legendary quest item, and then they could leave. They could do whatever they want. So you would just sell your lockout, and I made a decent amount of money doing that. Like, so this is a pretty lucrative fight, if nothing else. But I think this is a pretty fun fight. I would put this in above average. This is like to me, this is like the breath of fresh air part of Dragon Soul. Like, Hagara was a pretty fun fight. Then we have Ultraxion. And Ultraxion, kind of similarly to Xana's, you felt different about this fight if you were a healer. This was probably a really good healer fight. If you're a tank or a DPS, you're just standing in one spot, clicking an extraction button, and DPSing. As far as patchwork fights are concerned, I don't think it was a bad fight. I think Ultraxion introducing the extra action button puts it up for me. It's unsatisfactory. But I don't think Ultraxion was a bad fight necessarily, and I think it was super fun as a healer. I think our first heroic kill on Ultraxion, we had a Holy Paladin solo heal this whole fight, and he had a blast, because the way Ultraxion worked was he did a lot of AoE damage, a lot of tank damage, but he also gave 3 different buffs. He spawned 3 different gems, and depending on what you are, it was either a lot of crit, a lot of damage, or a lot of mana. And the healer one will pick a lot of mana and healing and just go crazy. So, yeah. As a healer, amazing fight if you're a healer, if you got to solo heal this. As a DPS in a tank, all you're really doing is just making sure you press your extraction button at the right time and not die, and you're fine. Next, we have I don't remember this guy's name. He's a Tauren, I know that, but I just don't remember his name. Let me see if I can find him real quick. I don't know why his name escapes me. I know it's like Warlord something. Let me see. It's not coming up. There it is. Let's see. This does not want to load for me. Whatever. We'll continue. But as far as his fight, this is Boat Captain. Whatever. We'll call him Boat Captain for now. Boat Captain. Oh, it actually just loaded. His name is Warmaster Blackthorn. That's what his name is. Warmaster Blackhorn. My bad. Not Blackthorn. Blackhorn. And he was basically the gunship of Dragon Soul. Now, he wasn't as easy as Wrath gunship, because his mechanics actually were real, where instead of just, shoot cannons, stop, jump over, kill mage, come back, shoot cannons, it was actually a little bit more than that. He summoned a lot of adds, and they were soak mechanics. So basically the crux of this fight was the boat that you were riding on was getting bombarded by his adds, and you had to soak them, right? There were little swirlies and there were big swirlies. Little swirlies could be soaked by one person, big swirlies had to be soaked by a couple people. If you let the big swirlies go through, it would do a lot of damage to the boat. It would blow up the boat. GG, you got wiped. On top of all that, the tanks are tanking this guy. In the first phase, they're tanking his ass, his commanders, his lieutenant adds, right? Each add did something different, but you get the gist. Once you killed enough of his Drake Riders / lieutenant adds, he would jump down, and he had a whole bunch of different mechanics. And I think for where this fight is, it's a small platform that has a lot kind of going on for it, because, like I said, there were soak mechanics, there were high priority adds to kill, there were a couple high priority adds to kill. There were dragons you had to fight. Like, there's a lot going on for this small platform, and whenever you have like intimate settings like that, but a lot of things going on, it makes coordination, in my opinion, feel a lot better when you do get it down. So with Blackthorn, I put him, before I would have put him in satisfactory, but I think I would put him at the bottom of above average, because just like Hagara, he has a lot of varied things on one platform. Now, obviously, there's nothing to sell on this guy, but I would put him in above average. I think he has more going for him than the rest of these fights in the satisfactory tier. And then we have the final two. We have the Spine of Deathwing, and then we have the Madness of Deathwing. So Spine, I think, gets its infamy for being regarded as the fight harder than the last fight. Like in raids, generally speaking, the last fight is kind of the hardest fight of that tier. But for a lot of guilds never made it past Spine. Spine was a pretty hard fight. And some people thought that Spine was harder than Madness. And in a lot of ways it was, because it's not that the mechanics were super oppressive. It just required a lot of damage, but a lot of burst damage specifically. So the way Spine worked was you were fighting on Deathwing's back, as you can see in the little icon here. You were fighting on Deathwing's back, and the way it worked is there would be tentacles that would spawn. You would kill them, and they would leave a little fire spot on the ground. And if you stood there, you got tethered to his back, because periodically Deathwing would roll, and if you weren't tethered, you would just fall off. Right? You would do a barrel roll, and the way the barrel roll worked is if there were more people, if there was in a raid size of, let's say, 10, if there were 8 people on one side and 2 people on the other, he would roll trying to shake you off. So that was one mechanic. But the burst damage mechanic came into play where when his Elementium plate got lifted up, there was a tendon that got summoned. Or that got summoned. Why do I keep saying summoned? There was a tendon under the plate. And what you're basically trying to do is when the plate gets lifted, you DPS the tendon, break it, the plate gets removed. You go to the next elemental plate. It lifts up, you DPS the tendon, you break it, it goes through. You had to do that, I think, for like 3 plates. But you only had a short window of time to DPS this tendon, and then the plate would close. So if you didn't one-phase it, it just made the fight a lot longer. More adds would spawn, more fire damage would take, because the tether did fire damage. More chances for people to fall off from roll. Like, it was a lot going on. And there were only there was a small handful of classes that were able to do a lot of burst damage. Like, there weren't a lot of burst damage profiles, but I'll say the infamous ones. Mages with Dragon's Wrath, definitely. Dragon's Wrath kind of took mages to another level. Elemental Shamans with Dragon's Wrath, Frost DKs, Rogues with Legendary Daggers. Like, these classes did a lot of damage in a short amount of time. So, like, a lot of guilds prioed those classes and kind of deprioed, like, Affliction Locks, Demo Locks, things that, like, kind of did slower damage or spread out damage. So there was that, and then there was a healer mechanic that put a healing absorb on you, and this could really be important, really be a pug killer, or not even a pug killer, just a guild stopper, because the absorb was really high, and people were still taking damage. But there was one caveat. The one caveat was, if you had a Resto Shaman, they could drop Spirit Link Totem and almost instantaneously remove the debuff from everybody, because Spirit Link Totem redistributes health for the duration, and that redistribution counts as healing. So Resto Shamans were pretty cracked on this fight. Plus, Resto Shamans love stacked healing anyway. So, and there was a lot of stacked healing on Spine of Deathwing. So as far as its tiering is concerned, I think Spine of Deathwing goes into the king tier. I think it's better than a lot of the fights under here, and even though it wasn't always fun having to, I was a Frost DK, I was a 1-minute class. Everything revolved around Pillar of Frost, and Killing Machine just procced. So I was like, if I got a good Killing Machine string, it was great. Like, Frost was really, really, really good for that. But yeah, I think it's in king tier. I think it's in the same or similar veins as the rest of these fights. It doesn't have as many phases as these fights. Well, it has more. It has kind of an ongoing phase. We'll call it that. Like the Elementium plates really are what you would consider the phases, because you had to keep going. And each plate you killed just meant more adds are spawning, which means the tanks are taking more damage, which means it was just a lot going on. So yeah, I think Spine of Deathwing definitely goes in king tier. Some people might feel differently because some guilds, like I said, never made it past Spine. And then lastly, we have the Madness of Deathwing. I'm going to keep it a whole stack with you. I did not like this fight at all. At all. It was okay the first kill, the second kill, the third kill. After that, I'm like, okay, all we're really doing is DPSing tentacles and jumping from platform to platform. That's not really what I envisioned when I fought Deathwing. I'll keep it a buck with you. For anybody who played Dragonflight, and you did the Aberrus raid, the Neltharion fight in that raid to me is better than Madness and Deathwing. It's a little bit of what Madness should have been. Not jumping from platform to platform, fighting tentacles. Like, that's not what I think when I say I'm going to fight Deathwing. So I think yeah, I didn't like Madness. There were some cool things with Madness, right? Like each platform, there was a dragon aspect there giving you a buff, doing different things. So it kind of changed up the fight a little bit. But after your like 8th heroic kill, and I mean, to be fair, I'll give Madness some credit. After an 8th kill on anything, things can get kind of old. But to me, Madness at Deathwing just was a slog. And it was a long fight, too. It wasn't as long as the infamous Ragnaros, but it was a long fight, too. So, yeah, I got to put it in. We'll get old fast, but not fast enough. I won't say it's dirt tier, because I think it's better than the dirt tier bosses, but by God, I think it gets old fast. All right, so we made it through all of the bosses. Now let's just try to tier it individually. So in God tier, I have Sinestro and I have Alysrazor. I'm okay with that. I think Sinestro is definitely a better fight than Alysrazor. Alysrazor's fun is really, really predicated on if you're flying or not. If you weren't flying, you kind of missed out. If you weren't flying and you never flew, you missed out on a major part of the fight. So that kind of puts it down for me. But the ground phase was fun. But if you didn't fly and you never got a chance to, Alysrazor might not be the one for you, but I think Alysrazor is God tier. King tier. We have Neff, Cho'Gall, Beth'tilac, and Spine of Deathwing. I would say I like the way this is. I might put Spine above Beth'tilac, but Beth'tilac was a really, really fun fight for me, in my experience. But I don't think Beth'tilac is better than Cho'Gall or Nefarian. I will say that. I will say that. Next, we have above average tier. And for this one, I think Ragnaros is comfortably at the top of the above average tier. I think Omnitron could go above Halfus. Because just like Halfus, where each week there's a different dragon setup in 10 man at least, 25 man I think it's the same way. Omnitron is the same way. You don't always start with the same 2 bosses week to week. So it's a little bit of variance there, right? And I think Omnitron's heroic mode is better than Halfus's heroic mode, so I'll give it credit for that. For the last couple of fights, I think Shannox, Hagara, and Warmaster Blackthorn are fine. I'll say this: I think Shannox. I think Hagara is a better fight than Shannox. I think Shannox has a better setting because you can fight him anywhere. Like the way you spawn him, where you fight him, how you move him, stuff like that. All that plays a part into the encounter. So I give more credence and credit to Shannox for that. Hagara, you know how I feel about, and then Blackthorn, you only really fight him for half of the fight, because like the second half of the fight, and it's in a confined area, which I think works for this fight, but a little bit, not much variance. So yeah, I think this is fine. Satisfactory tier. We have Magmar, Rhyolith, Chimeron, the Twin Drakes, Ascendant Council, and Ultraxion. I'll say this: I think I'm gonna move Ascendant Council above Chimeron and the Twin Drakes. I think Rhyolith goes above Magmar. I think it's just a better fight than Magmar, even though Magmar is really fun. And honestly, I think Ascendant. Yeah, I think this is better. I think Rhyolith is the best of the satisfactory tier. Like I said, it could get old. The driving thing can get old. Stomping on volcanoes can get old, but it's not a long fight. It doesn't overstay its welcome. The Ascendant Council, there's a lot going on, but it's one of those fights where when you get the coordination down, it just feels good to do. Plus, you get buffs. Everyone loves buffs. Magmar, I think, is a phenomenal first boss. First boss. Has a few mechanics. Again, doesn't overstay its welcome. Chimeron's an interesting fight. It's the most interesting fight in this tier, in this little tier here, because it forces the healers to not just pump, keep it controlled, keep your mana control in line, don't overspend your mana, don't overheal people. So I think Chimeron gets a nod for that. To me, V and T are just kind of there. Like, they have varied mechanics, but they're just kind of there. And Altraxion, I think, is a patchwork fight that, depending on your role, you will get major enjoyment out of it, or you'll just get average to minimal enjoyment out of it. In the D tier, in the Death to the Pugs tier, I think Alakir should go at the top of this. Oh no, well, if I'm doing it like funnest to least funnest, which I'm trying to do, I'll go on a limb, and I'll do this. We'll do it like this. I think Baleroc is the best of the Death to the Pugs one, because on paper his mechanics are simplistic. He doesn't have any real gimmicks to him, like outside of like the tank swapping thing, like the fire sword versus the shadow sword thing. I think his fight is incredibly boring if you're the OT. So I'm sorry to the OTs. I think if you're a healer, you're gonna have a lot of fun on this fight, because you're healing people, getting a buff, giving a buff, doing all that sort of thing. I think if you're a DPS, this only gets not fun if someone's messing up and you have to cover their slack. If you have to soak a shard when you can't, or you didn't want to, you have to run over to it. Like, that's where Baleroc gets a little oppressive. But other than that, he's not a bad fight. Not better than anything above him, but it's kind of meh. Xana's, I think, is cool being second, because again, his mechanic in theory was good. I think the execution was wrong, and I think we even saw like his mechanic come back in the N'Zoth raid in BFA with the soccer ball boss. I think that was a better execution of his style mechanic. I think he inspired it. But I mean, even that fight was a little buggy. But just having 2 stack points, having the ball be able to pass through the raid group. If the melee group was too close, it would hit him and then go into the phase at the incorrect time. If the range group, moved too much, or there wasn't enough stack people to register a hit, it would pass right through them and hit the wall and go into the intermission phase too. Like, there's just a lot going on with it. So, but I like the effort for Xana's at the very least. Alakir was an oppressive fight. Honestly, I'm gonna put him at the bottom, to be honest, because at least with Maloriak isn't as long as Alakir. Alakir is just a long, oppressive fight, and he's coming off of the back of a pretty shitty first boss. So Alakir was just a long, oppressive fight. And the will get old fast here. I'll say this: the Deathwing fight is the best fight in this tier. It's way more varied than these other two. And I mean, it's the final fight of the expansion, so that's an obvious duh. But it's the best fight in here. But to me, I think it'll get old fast, especially if you're DPSing. I'm gonna put Yorsage above Archimedes, because at least for healers, it's pretty varied. Because Ooze deaths control how you play. Because like I said, you got the blue one that'll take all your mana and store it, and then when you kill the blue orb, it gives you it back. When you kill the black ooze, it does something. When you kill the yellow ooze, it does something. So yeah, I think Yorsage definitely comes next, and then you have Archimedes at the end. And then for the dirt tier, for the bad ones, just because Fandral, literally, you could just one phase and not even see his cat form or his other mechanics, he has to go at the bottom. Morchok at least makes another Morchok that you kind of got to deal with separately. And like, I'm kind of a sucker for divide and conquer style fights. Like, I loved in Siege of Orgrimmar, I love Spoils of Pandaria, splitting the raid group up and trying to kind of like dividing them and conquer. I like fights like that. So when even like in what's a more recent example, like the Thorum fight in Old War. I like that fight because you have your tunnel group and then you have the arena group. Like, I like divide and conquer fights. So at least you got a chance to do a little bit of that on Morchok. I'll give it that. Same thing with the council, even though the council you were kind of like forced to. I mean, I guess you're forced to do it anyway. Is council better than Morchok? Probably not. But both of them are better than Fandral Staghelm. And that's really it for the tier, guys. I had a lot of fun making this. Trying to build up some anticipation for Cat. I'm gonna be real. Like, you probably heard me say it in my other videos. Like, my anticipation and excitement level for Cata was at an all time low. It was at the lowest. It was on the lowest totem pole of WoW versions I wanted to play. It's coming up now. Now that I've gotten into the beta and I'm reminding myself of the fun that I had in Cata and like the class changes and stuff like that. And if I can get a couple friends to play, which I think I'm on the verge of doing, I think it'll be a much more enjoyable experience. And especially if they do some changes. If they do, like, we're going in with the 4.3 patch, so classes are not going to be the same, right? So I think it'll be a more enjoyable experience this second go around. And like I said before in one of my streams, Cata just got a bad rap. I never thought Cata was a bad expansion, even though it was deemed as the first bad expansion. I never thought it was a bad expansion. I just thought people loved Wrath so much, and Cata wasn't that they just insulted Cata for it. They caught flack for it. So I think that's what it is. I hated Dragon Soul, but I love Firelands. Like, it has one of the best raids ever made in it. So you kind of got to give Cata some credit. But that's really it for the stream, guys. If you stuck with me the whole time, I appreciate it. If you catch this on a watch back, I appreciate it. And let me know if you think I was wrong or I was right. Or I guess there's no right and wrong here. Let me know your opinions on my tiering. If you think something should be higher, something should be lower, if you have different memories, if you have different experiences, I want to hear about them. Let me know. Other than like and subscribe if you want to see more. Other than that, y'all been great. I've been Soul, and I'm out. Peace.